I never expected the biggest fight in my family to start over a place most of them had never even visited. But apparently, owning something you've worked for makes you selfish when your younger sibling decides she wants it. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and about 3 years ago I finally achieved something I'd been dreaming about since my early 20s. I bought a small lake cabin a few hours outside the city. Nothing about it came easy. Nobody gifted it to me. Nobody helped with the down payment. I spent years grinding through 70-hour workweeks at a consulting company, skipping vacations, living in a tiny apartment, and driving a car that rattled every time I hit the highway. While friends were upgrading their lifestyles, I was stuffing every extra dollar into savings. That cabin became my reward. Whenever work gets overwhelming, I head there for a few days. It's quiet. No traffic. No constant emails. No clients demanding immediate answers. I started writing a novel there, something I'd wanted to do for years but never had the mental space for. For me, that place isn't some luxury toy. It's the one place where I feel like I can actually hear myself think. Unfortunately, my family sees it differently. To understand why, you need a little background. My dad has always believed that fairness means giving more to whoever needs more. In theory, that sounds noble. In practice, it usually meant my younger sister, Madison, got whatever she wanted while I was expected to figure things out on my own. When I worked after school to save money for college, she got a brand new car at 16 because, according to Dad, young women need dependable transportation. When I graduated buried under student loans, her entire degree was paid for because my parents supposedly didn't want her to struggle the way I had. At the time, I told myself it wasn't worth fighting about. I focused on building my own life. I thought I'd moved past all of it. Then last month Dad called. At first, it sounded like a normal conversation. Then he got to the real reason. "I've been thinking," he said. "You should let Madison use the cabin whenever she wants." I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Dad went on to explain that young people deserve opportunities and experiences more than successful adults need vacation properties. His exact point was that I was sitting on a resource that could create meaningful memories for Madison and her friends. A resource. Like he was talking about a public park instead of something I'd spent years working toward. I tried staying calm. I explained that the cabin isn't sitting empty. I use it constantly. Usually 2 weekends every month, sometimes longer when I'm working remotely. It's where I recharge. Dad wasn't interested. According to him, my need for peace and quiet wasn't as important as Madison's need to experience life. Then he dropped a phrase that honestly stunned me. Wealth redistribution should start with family. I wish I were kidding. For context, Madison graduated college less than a year ago. She's currently living at home rent-free while working part-time at a trendy wellness studio. Most of her social media content revolves around positive energy, abundance, and living authentically. Apparently, living authentically now requires access to my property. At first I tried being diplomatic. Then I made the mistake of saying, if those experiences matter so much, maybe she could save up and buy her own place someday. That didn't go over well. Dad immediately accused me of being selfish. He said success had changed me. That I was becoming obsessed with material possessions. That I was refusing to share my blessings because of a scarcity mindset. The irony nearly gave me a headache. The same people who never contributed $1 toward this cabin were lecturing me about generosity. Still, I tried not to lose my temper. Then things got worse. Near the end of the call, Dad told me he was disappointed in the man I'd become. And then he brought my late mother into it. He said she would be heartbroken if she saw me choosing property over family. That one hit hard. My mom passed away 5 years ago. She was the person who encouraged me to save for something that would give me peace someday. She understood how badly I needed space to decompress. Hearing her memory used as leverage felt incredibly unfair. After that, I ended the conversation. Since then, Dad has sent multiple texts asking me to reconsider. Madison hasn't contacted me directly, but she's been posting vague social media quotes about selfish relatives, forgotten roots, and the difference between being successful and being meaningful. Coincidentally, those posts started appearing right after our argument. My aunt even called me last week to say people have been discussing me at family gatherings. Apparently, I've become the greedy older brother who refuses to share. At first, I figured the drama would die down. I was very, very wrong. For everyone asking whether I'd ever let Madison use the cabin before, the answer is yes. Twice. And honestly, that history should have been my warning. Both times she promised it would be a quiet weekend. Just her and maybe one friend. Nothing crazy. Both times I arrived later to discover evidence that quiet weekend apparently meant a full-blown party. Empty bottles were stuffed into trash bags. My deck had scorch marks from someone setting up a hookah. One of my neighbors casually mentioned that music had been going until sunrise. To be fair, she cleaned most of it up afterward. But that wasn't really the issue. The issue was trust. As for another common question, the cabin is completely paid off. I bought it outright because I didn't want the stress of a mortgage hanging over me. According to my dad, that somehow makes me even less justified in protecting it. His logic was basically, you don't have payments, so what's the big deal? That was the situation when I posted. 3 weeks later, everything got much worse. A lot of people suggested I have one final conversation with Dad before drawing a hard line. So I tried. I really did. I wrote down exactly what I wanted to say. I promised myself I wouldn't get emotional. I even came prepared with a compromise. Madison could use the cabin once a month. All I asked was advance notice, a refundable cleaning deposit, and a simple written agreement covering basic rules and responsibility for damages. Honestly, I thought I was being generous. Dad didn't. The fact that you want a contract with your own sister tells me everything I need to know, he said. Then he launched into another lecture about family, trust, and how money had changed me. He refused to discuss any of the actual details. So I stopped negotiating. I told him the cabin was off limits unless I personally approved each visit ahead of time. No exceptions. I figured the message was clear. I was wrong. Very wrong. About a week later, my girlfriend Claire and I planned a trip to the cabin. Work had been brutal, and I'd been looking forward to spending a few quiet days writing. The moment we turned into the driveway, something felt off. There were cars everywhere. Not one or two. A whole line of them. At least 8. Then I heard the music. My stomach dropped. I parked and walked toward the front door. The second I stepped inside, I knew exactly what had happened. My cabin had been turned into some kind of social media wellness event. Yoga mats covered the floor. Decorative candles were everywhere. Crystals sat on nearly every surface in the house. Someone had transformed my living room into a photography area with lights, backdrops, and tripods. In the kitchen, a group of strangers was participating in what sounded like a juice cleanse workshop. Outside, people I'd never seen before were sitting on my deck doing breathing exercises. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I was in the wrong house. Then Madison spotted me. Instead of looking embarrassed, she looked annoyed. "Oh my God," she said, throwing her hands up. "You're bringing such negative energy into this space right now." I just stared at her. She continued. "We're in the middle of an intention-setting retreat." An intention-setting retreat. In my house. Without my permission. That was the moment I stopped trying to be reasonable. I told everyone they had 30 minutes to leave. Immediately. Madison protested. She claimed Dad had said everything was fine. Then she started talking about how I was emotionally blocked and needed to be more open to abundance. One of her friends actually approached me holding a bundle of burning herbs and offered to cleanse my energy. Meanwhile, I was already dialing the police. The deeper I looked around, the worse it got. Someone had placed burning incense directly on a custom wooden coffee table I'd spent months restoring. Permanent burn marks covered the surface. The bathroom walls were smeared with some kind of beauty treatment that looked like an art project gone wrong. Furniture had been moved all over the cabin because they wanted to improve the flow of energy. My cast iron skillet, the one I'd spent years seasoning, had apparently been repurposed for some kind of herbal ritual. Then I noticed something that genuinely upset me. People had gone through my personal office. Drawers were open. Items had been moved. Even my writing desk had been touched. That's where I keep drafts of the novel I've been working on for years. Suddenly it wasn't just property damage anymore. It felt personal. But somehow there was still one final surprise waiting for me. The hot tub. The second I lifted the cover, I nearly lost my mind. The water had turned into a cloudy swamp of flower petals, oils, powders, and whatever else they'd dumped inside. The filtration system was completely clogged. At the bottom sat some elaborate crystal arrangement that had scratched the interior surface. I just stood there staring. Years of work. Years of saving. Years of maintaining that place. And they treated it like a free event venue. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. Photos. Videos. Receipts. Repair estimates. When all the numbers came together, the damages and professional cleaning costs totaled roughly $3,400. I sent Madison a detailed invoice. Her response arrived a few hours later. Not an apology. Not even an acknowledgement. Instead, she made a public social media post about how some people value possessions more than human experiences. Apparently I was one of those people. Dad called that same evening. I remember thinking maybe he'd finally understand. Maybe seeing the actual damage would change his perspective. It didn't. He was furious. Not at Madison. At me. According to him, I'd embarrassed her in front of her entire wellness community. He said I'd humiliated her guests. That I'd made family feel unwelcome. At one point he actually asked, "How much would it cost you to just let this go?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It'll cost me about $3,400, I said, plus the fact that she broke into my property after being told not to. There was silence for a second. Then Dad sighed. "I didn't raise you to be this petty." And that's when I realized this wasn't really about the cabin anymore. Something much bigger was happening. And I had no idea how far Dad and Madison were willing to take it. The fallout was immediate. And somehow I became the villain. Madison started telling anyone who would listen that she'd been hosting a peaceful retreat for stressed young professionals and that I had stormed in and destroyed a safe, healing environment. Funny how her version never included the part where she entered my property without permission. Or the strangers. Or the damage. Or the fact that she'd already been told she wasn't allowed there. Those details somehow never made it into the story. The family reaction was exactly what you'd expect. My Aunt Karen called to tell me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving unless I apologized. Not for being ignored. Not for having my property trashed. For making Madison feel embarrassed in front of her friends. One cousin texted me a 3-paragraph lecture about greed and privilege. Another accused me of caring more about possessions than people. At one point I actually wondered whether I was losing my mind. Then my Uncle Dave sent me a message. Just one sentence. "Your father tried the same thing with my fishing cabin 20 years ago. Don't cave." That text did more for my sanity than anything else. At least someone understood. The following weekend, I stayed at the cabin to handle repairs myself. The hot tub technician took one look at the water and started laughing. "What happened here?" he asked. I explained. He shook his head. "Third retreat-related repair call I've had this month." Apparently I wasn't the first property owner to discover that spiritual enlightenment and respecting other people's belongings don't always go together. I wish that had been the end of the story. It wasn't. While cleaning my office, I found something that genuinely upset me. My manuscript. The novel I'd been working on for years. Pages were scattered out of order. Several chapters had coffee stains on them. Someone had clearly been handling them. I sat there staring at the mess for a long time. The property damage annoyed me. The hot tub infuriated me. But seeing months of creative work treated like disposable clutter hit differently. It felt personal. After that, I made a decision. I installed cameras. I changed every lock. And I stopped attending family gatherings. At least until somebody acknowledged reality. Instead, things escalated. 6 weeks later, I had a new update. And somehow it was even more ridiculous. Remember the invoice? The one Madison ignored? Well, she never paid it. Instead, she launched a crowdfunding campaign. I'm serious. The fundraiser was titled something along the lines of helping a young entrepreneur survive family financial abuse. According to her description, I was using money and legal threats to suppress her wellness business. She claimed the repair costs were fabricated. That I was punishing her for pursuing her dreams. That she was being targeted by an unsupportive family member. The campaign raised several $100s before someone sent me the link. I reported it immediately. The platform removed it not long afterward. But not before I noticed something interesting. Several relatives who'd spent weeks calling me selfish had donated. Including my father. That should have been enough drama for one family. Unfortunately, Dad was only getting started. About 2 weeks later he invited me to lunch. Our usual diner. The place we'd gone for important conversations my entire life. The moment he suggested it, I felt uneasy. That diner carried history. It was where he told me he and Mom were divorcing. Where he announced major life decisions. Where every serious conversation seemed to happen. Part of me suspected an ambush. Part of me still hoped he wanted to fix things. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal. He asked about work. Asked about my writing. Even seemed genuinely interested in how the novel was progressing. I started thinking maybe we'd finally turned a corner. Then he said a sentence that immediately set off alarm bells. I've been thinking a lot about legacy. There it was. I felt my stomach sink. Dad reached beside him and pulled out a folder. An actual folder. The kind people bring to business presentations. At first I thought maybe it was paperwork related to the family estate. It wasn't. Inside were printed property listings. Articles. Charts. Spreadsheets. He'd prepared an entire presentation. One section contained listings for smaller vacation properties he considered more appropriate for a single man. Another contained articles about the benefits of nature-based healing programs for young adults. Then came a spreadsheet comparing usage rates. He'd somehow calculated that I only used the cabin a handful of days each month, while Madison could supposedly utilize it much more frequently. As if the value of ownership was measured by occupancy percentages. I sat there speechless. Then he showed me the final section. Property transfer documents. That's when everything clicked. Dad wasn't trying to negotiate access anymore. He wasn't asking for compromises. He wanted ownership. His proposal was simple. Transfer the cabin to Madison. In exchange, he'd contribute $50,000 toward another property that would supposedly be a smarter investment for me. For a second, I genuinely thought he was joking. Then I realized he was completely serious. The cabin was worth well over $400,000. Maybe more. And he was presenting $50,000 as some kind of generous offer. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. The whole thing was so absurd that my brain treated it like a joke. Dad didn't laugh. His face hardened immediately. And that's when I realized the presentation had only been plan A. The moment I rejected it, he was ready to move on to something else. Something much worse. Dad's expression changed the second I laughed. The friendly, concerned father act disappeared. "You don't appreciate what you've been given," he said coldly. I was already reaching for my jacket. Then he leaned forward. "Madison brings people together. She creates joy, community, purpose. You use that place to isolate yourself." I just stared at him. He kept going. "Your mother would have wanted that property filled with life. Not used as some hideout where you disappear from the world." That one stung. Mostly because he knew exactly which buttons to push. I stood up ready to leave. That's when he grabbed my wrist. Not aggressively but firmly enough that it stopped me. "Think about your future," he said. "You're 30. No wife. No children. What exactly are you building? Madison is creating something meaningful. That cabin could become the center of a real community instead of a place where you sit alone." I don't know where the response came from. Maybe months of frustration finally boiled over. Maybe I was tired of hearing my mother's name used as a weapon. Whatever the reason, the words came out before I could stop them. Mom left me her engagement ring. Dad blinked. "What?" "The ring she wanted me to give my future wife someday." I shrugged. Maybe I should hand that to Madison too. After all, she could probably get more use out of it than I can. "Isn't that your logic? Whoever uses something more deserves it." The silence that followed was incredible. His face immediately turned red. Apparently that comparison was completely unfair. According to Dad, the ring was different. The ring was sentimental. The ring had emotional value. I remember laughing again. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. Somehow my mother's ring deserved protection. But the one thing I'd spent years sacrificing to build did not. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. I left shortly afterward. I wish that had been the end. It wasn't. A few days later, I received an email from an attorney. Not a formal legal filing. Not a lawsuit. Just what could best be described as a friendly warning. The email suggested that my father and sister were exploring options regarding the equitable distribution of family assets and encouraged me to consider mediation before matters became more complicated. I read it 3 times. Then I forwarded it directly to my lawyer. Thankfully, my job provides legal assistance as part of my benefits package. His response was reassuring. "They have no case." Those were his exact words. The cabin wasn't inherited. It wasn't family property. It wasn't jointly owned. I bought it myself. End of discussion. But then he added something interesting. "They're probably hoping you'll get nervous and negotiate." That sounded exactly like Dad. Pressure first. Reason later. If reason ever came at all. Then my lawyer found something neither of us expected. Madison had already started advertising retreats. Not future retreats. Current bookings. On her business page she was promoting summer wellness weekends at my cabin. My cabin. The one she didn't own. The one she'd been explicitly banned from entering. She was charging people hundreds of dollars for spots. Offering accommodations she had absolutely no legal right to offer. For several minutes I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or panic. The confidence was almost impressive. She wasn't acting like someone hoping to obtain the property. She was acting like someone who already believed it belonged to her. Meanwhile, the family pressure campaign continued. Every week brought another call. Another lecture. Another relative explaining why I should sacrifice for the greater good. One cousin informed me that Madison cried at family gatherings whenever my name came up. An uncle told me possessions were temporary and relationships were forever. That statement would have carried more weight if those same people weren't demanding my possessions. What frustrated me most was the selective memory. Nobody mentioned the financial help I'd provided over the years. Nobody mentioned the emergency expenses I'd covered. Nobody mentioned the countless times I'd stepped in when someone needed money. Apparently generosity only counted when it was unlimited. The moment I said no, none of that history mattered anymore. Then came the incident that finally pushed me from frustrated to genuinely concerned. My neighbor near the cabin called one Saturday afternoon. "Hey," he said. "I think you should check your cameras." My stomach immediately dropped. When I reviewed the footage, there was Madison, standing at my front door, trying key after key. Her boyfriend was with her, looking around the property, watching the road. When none of the keys worked, they moved to a side window, then another, then another. At one point it genuinely looked like they were trying to force one open. When that failed, they walked over to my neighbor's house and asked whether he had a spare key. Their explanation? "We're family." As though that magically overrode ownership laws. Watching the footage felt surreal. For months I'd wondered whether Dad and Madison actually believed their own arguments. That video answered the question. They did. Completely. In their minds, my boundaries simply didn't matter. After discussing everything with my attorney, I sent a formal cease and desist notice. I also began transferring the cabin into an LLC for additional legal protection. My lawyer even suggested documenting every interaction in case things escalated further. The words "restraining order" entered the conversation. I never imagined I'd hear those words in relation to my own family, but here we were. Still, none of that was the hardest part. The hardest part happened a few days later. While sorting through some old boxes, I found a letter. One I'd never seen before. It was written by my mother. Dated about a month before she passed away. I sat alone in the cabin and read it 3 times. In the letter, she talked about how proud she was of me, how hard I'd worked, how determined I was to build a stable life. And then there was one passage I couldn't stop thinking about. She wrote that she hoped I'd someday find a place where I could write, think, and have the solitude I always seemed to need. Not because I was antisocial. Not because I was hiding. Because that was where I felt most like myself. She understood something Dad never did. Some people recharge through crowds. Others recharge through quiet. Neither is wrong. Reading those words hit me harder than anything else that had happened. Because for months Dad had been telling everyone what Mom would have wanted. Meanwhile, the only evidence I had from her directly suggested the exact opposite. So that's where things stand now. According to half my family, I'm a selfish man clinging to property. According to Madison, I'm standing in the way of her purpose. According to Dad, I'm destroying family unity. Maybe they're right about one thing. The cabin has changed my life. Just not in the way they think. Because it taught me something I probably should have learned years ago. The people who benefit most from your boundaries are usually the ones who get angry when you finally enforce them. At that point, I genuinely thought things couldn't get any more ridiculous. I was wrong. Again. A lot of people had asked whether there would be another update. Honestly, I hoped there wouldn't be. I wanted to finish my novel, spend time at the cabin, and move on with my life. Instead, the next 2 months turned into the most exhausting chapter of this entire saga. Let's start with the legal mess. Because yes, Madison actually tried to sue me. I wish I were exaggerating. After weeks of threats and passive-aggressive social media posts, she filed a lawsuit claiming that I had caused her emotional distress and unfairly interfered with her business opportunities. Her argument was somehow even stranger than I expected. According to her filing, my ownership of the cabin had created an implied expectation that family members would always have access to it. By refusing access, I had supposedly damaged her emotionally and financially because she'd already built part of her wellness business around using the property. Read that again. She built a business around a cabin she didn't own, then blamed me for refusing to hand it over. Even my lawyer struggled to keep a straight face. The case made it to mediation before falling apart almost immediately. Under questioning, Madison admitted several things she probably shouldn't have. She admitted she'd never contributed a single dollar toward the purchase, taxes, maintenance, or repairs. She admitted I'd never promised her unrestricted access. She admitted she'd begun advertising retreats before even discussing the idea with me. And when asked to explain the emotional distress she'd suffered, her answer was essentially that she felt unsupported in her personal journey. The mediator actually paused and asked her to clarify. The explanation didn't improve. By the end of the session, it was obvious where things were heading. The mediator strongly suggested withdrawing the complaint before it reached a courtroom. To everyone's surprise except mine, Madison agreed. But not before making one final attempt. Her proposed settlement? She wanted exclusive use of the cabin for the entire summer. June. July, and August, the busiest season of the year. The season when I used the cabin most. When I politely declined, she accused me of committing what she called spiritual violence. I will never forget the mediator's expression. It looked like a man questioning every career decision he'd ever made. But the legal drama wasn't even the biggest revelation. The biggest surprise came from someone I barely knew. My father's girlfriend. Let's call her Diane. Until recently, I didn't even know she existed. That's not an exaggeration. Dad had spent years talking about Mom's memory, acting like he was still devoted to her legacy while simultaneously using her name to pressure me. Meanwhile, he'd been in a serious relationship for years. Diane contacted me privately. Apparently she'd reached her limit after sitting through a dinner where Dad spent hours complaining about me to anyone willing to listen. She apologized for contacting me out of the blue. Then she started talking. What she told me explained almost everything. For years, Dad had been financially supporting Madison far more than anyone realized. Not a few $100s here and there. Thousands every month. He'd funded business idea after business idea. A jewelry brand that lasted 6 months. A mobile coffee venture that never launched. Several online coaching programs. And now the wellness retreat project. Every time one failed, another appeared. And every time Dad paid the bill. According to Diane, he'd even refinanced his house to keep helping her. That stopped me cold. Because suddenly the obsession with my cabin made sense. This wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about family. And it definitely wasn't about healing retreats. Dad had invested so much money into Madison's lifestyle that admitting failure wasn't an option anymore. If her latest venture collapsed, he'd have to face the reality that years of enabling hadn't helped her become independent. Then came the detail that changed my entire perspective. Dad was planning to move in with Diane. He hadn't told Madison. Apparently he was terrified she'd feel abandoned if she found out. So instead of setting boundaries, he kept trying to create solutions that would allow her to remain dependent while pretending she was thriving. Diane summed it up better than I ever could. I don't understand why he keeps protecting her from adulthood. That sentence stayed with me. Because suddenly everything fit. The cabin wasn't the real issue. The cabin was just the latest object caught in a much bigger family problem. Dad felt guilty. Madison felt entitled. And I happened to own something they both wanted. Once I understood that, making decisions became surprisingly easy. First, I hired a professional property management company. No exceptions. No favors. No family privileges. Anyone entering the property would need my written authorization. Period. Second, I upgraded the entire security system. More cameras. Remote monitoring. Cloud backups. Instant alerts. If anyone approached the property, I'd know immediately. Third, I sent a formal notice to every family member involved. The message was simple. Unauthorized access would be treated as trespassing. No exceptions. No negotiations. No emotional debates. Just consequences. Finally, I removed Madison from every social media platform. The final straw was a video she'd posted about cleansing herself from toxic relatives who valued greed over personal growth. Thousands of views. Hundreds of supportive comments. And not a single mention that the toxic relative she was talking about happened to be the legal owner of the property she was trying to take. For the first time in months, I stopped defending myself. Stopped arguing. Stopped explaining. Stopped hoping people would suddenly understand. And honestly, the silence felt incredible. For the first time since this entire nightmare started, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The biggest decision I made wasn't hiring lawyers. It wasn't upgrading security. And it definitely wasn't threatening trespassing charges. The biggest decision was choosing myself for once. A few weeks after everything exploded, I requested a 3-month sabbatical from work. No client calls. No endless meetings. No family drama. Just me, the cabin, and the novel I'd been putting off for years. For the first time in a long time, I felt excited about something again. Predictably, my family didn't see it that way. The backlash arrived almost immediately. I was officially removed from holiday plans. My aunt sent me a message about how I'd chosen isolation over family. One cousin called me selfish. Another said I was proof that money changes people. The family group chat somehow kept me in it while simultaneously talking about me. Every few days another passive-aggressive meme would appear. Quotes about generosity. Posts about family loyalty. Inspirational graphics about sharing blessings. At some point I stopped reading them. And something surprising happened. I felt lighter. Without the constant noise, I finally had room to think. Room to write. Room to breathe. By the end of the second month, I'd written over 60,000 words. More than I'd managed in the previous 2 years combined. The cabin felt like home again. Not a battleground. Not a legal dispute. Not a symbol of family dysfunction. Just home. I also got to know my neighbors properly. An older retired couple who lived down the road. Funny enough, they dealt with their own share of family entitlement over the years. What started as casual conversations turned into weekly dinners. Simple evenings. Good food. No drama. No manipulation. No guilt trips. Just normal human interaction. I hadn't realized how much I needed that. Then something happened that felt almost poetic. One afternoon I received a call from Diane, Dad's girlfriend. Apparently everything had finally blown up. Madison had discovered the truth about their relationship. The same sister who spent months accusing me of dishonoring Mom's memory was now furious that Dad had been dating someone for years without telling her. According to Diane, the reaction was explosive. Screaming. Accusations. Tears. The whole thing. Madison accused Dad of betraying Mom. Of lying to the family. Of destroying everything. The irony was impossible to ignore. For months Dad had used Mom's memory to pressure me. Now that same strategy had come back to him. Madison moved out shortly afterward and into her boyfriend's apartment. Then she stopped speaking to Dad completely. The silence devastated him. For the first time he was the one being shut out. Diane eventually asked me a question. Would you consider talking to him? I told her I'd think about it. And I did. A few days later I was sitting on the deck with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise spill over the mountains. The air was cool. The lake was still. The only sound was birds in the trees. I thought about everything that had happened. The pressure. The guilt. The manipulation. The lawsuits. The trespassing. The endless insistence that I owed people access to something I'd spent years building. And for the first time the answer felt simple. No, not right now. Maybe someday. But not now. Because I'd spent most of my life being the reasonable one. The understanding one. The one expected to sacrifice. And every compromise I'd made had simply taught people to ask for more. The truth is, family isn't just blood. It's trust, respect, reciprocity. It's people who care about your well-being as much as their own. And once that foundation disappears, DNA alone doesn't magically fix it. Around that same time, Uncle Dave stopped by for a weekend. We went fishing, cooked steaks, sat in the hot tub, which was finally functioning properly again, and talked about everything except family drama. Before leaving, he paused beside his truck and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. You know your mom would be proud of you. I didn't say anything. He continued. Not because you kept the cabin. He pointed toward the house. Because you finally stopped letting people walk over you. Then he drove away. And honestly, that meant more to me than any apology I've never received. So where does everything stand now? My sister's wellness business quietly disappeared once free access to my property was no longer part of the business model. Dad is dealing with the consequences of years of enabling behavior. Several family members still think I'm the villain. Others have started reaching out privately to admit they understand my side. As for me, the cabin is peaceful again. The cameras haven't recorded any more surprise visitors. My manuscript is nearly finished. And for the first time in years, my life feels like my own. One last unexpected thing happened. A friend mentioned my novel to a literary agent. She asked to read the opening chapters. A week later she called and asked for the full manuscript. Apparently years of family chaos make excellent source material. The working title is Inheritance of Silence. Maybe that'll change. Maybe it won't. Either way, the irony isn't lost on me. I bought the cabin because I wanted a quiet place to write. Instead, it became the setting for the most chaotic chapter of my life. And somehow, it still gave me exactly what I needed. Sometimes I wonder if cutting off so much of my family was too extreme. Maybe time will change my perspective. Or maybe distance was the only reason I finally found peace. AITA for refusing to give my sister access to my cabin and ultimately walking away from my family when they refused to respect my boundaries?